being here today. I am AFP's Southern Command Assistant Commissioner Hilda Sirek. I'm joined here today with Victoria Police Assistant Commissioner Bob Hill, Royal Canadian Mounted Police Superintendent Eric Gordon, Canadian Border Security Agency Liaison Officer Ryan Ord, and AFP's Chief Medical Officer Dr Alison Money. 6 men have been charged today with sourcing methamphetamine from a global criminal syndicate that has attempted to traffic almost 1.7 billion worth of high-harm drugs to Australia over several months. The Victorian Joint Organised Crime Task Force, working with our Five Eyes law enforcement partners, have prevented more than 6 tonnes of liquid and crystal methamphetamine from arriving in Australia in 4 separate ventures. The methamphetamine solely for the Australian market and destined for Victoria and New South Wales would have enabled almost 19 million individual street deals. It is almost a daily occurrence that state police or the AFP reveal another significant drug disruption. We know these are all too common. However, we do not want to become white noise on that issue that impacts directly and indirectly on almost every Australian. So today we are doing things differently. For the first time, the AFP's Chief Medical Officer will address the media about the dangers of methamphetamine. Methamphetamine is a horrific drug and that is highly addictive and has been linked to some of the most heartbreaking crimes across the country. As well as answering questions on Operation Parks, Assistant Commissioner Hill is also here to explain how methamphetamine is impacting on the community. We need the community to hear these messages because the most effective way of tackling illicit drug trafficking is to reduce demand. Australia has an illicit drug problem. Australians pay among the highest in the world for illicit drugs, and that's why transnational serious organised crime, or TSOC, target Australia. The AFP is not alleging that those arrested this week in Operation Parks is linked to state actors. However, TSOC are a national security threat. They attempt to corrupt officials to get their drugs into the country, and they collude with other criminal groups like outlaw motorcycle gangs and other local syndicates, which are violent and have been responsible for some of the deadly drug wars playing out in Australian suburbs. The obscene amount of money made by criminals profiting from the misery they peddle also undermines our community. And we see this through the billions of dollars of illegal wealth being laundered into Australia each and every year. We believe a global organised crime group using Canada as a launch pad is responsible for these 4 separate ventures. These investigations are continuing, and I want to thank my counterparts from Canada and New Zealand for working with Australian authorities to prevent these drugs coming into Australia. I'll now hand over to Assistant Commissioner Bob Hill, and each of us will take turns in opening a statement, and then we'll take your questions.
Thank you, Hilda, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. As Hilda indicated, my name is Bob Hill, an Assistant Commissioner for Crime Command, Victoria Police. Yesterday, as Hilda indicated, Victoria Police and the Australian Federal Police charged 6 individuals as part of an investigation that involved a significant importation of methamphetamine into this country. The joint investigation commenced in December 2022 when the Canada Border Services Agency identified illicit drugs in a shipment destined for Melbourne. This is one of the largest attempted imports of liquid methamphetamine into Australia. It involved in excess of 6 tonnes of methamphetamine worth an eye-watering $1.7 billion. The transnational nature of this operation is reflective of the current environment of organised crime. These criminals are not deterred by borders, they are motivated by greed and profit. As Hilda indicated, I did want to share with you the impact methamphetamine in particular has on our community as it relates to criminal behaviour. The community harm that this operation has prevented is immense. The product seized would have amounted to 19 million individual hits of methamphetamine. The seizure has prevented the associated community harm, which is not restricted to the end user. Drug trafficking impacts us all, especially as it relates to the associated crime in our local communities, on our roads and in our homes. Unfortunately, Australians have this insatiable appetite for illicit drugs, which makes us an incredibly lucrative market for organised crime. Our use of methamphetamine in this country, per capita, is matched by no other nation in the world. Make no mistake, the prevalence of these illicit substances within our society and the impact they have on human behaviour translates into road trauma, family violence, homicides, shootings and other violent offending intrinsically linked to the illicit drug trade. Let me provide some context about the road trauma aspect of this harm. In 2022, Victoria Police conducted 172,000 plus roadside drug tests and detected 10,000 plus positive results. Of those, 7,859 oral fluid tests and blood tests, they resulted in positive settings for methamphetamine. This means methamphetamine accounts for over 75% of those positive drug tests. Every single one of those nearly 8,000 people were a risk to themselves and other road users. The lives lost on our roads this year is the highest since 2007 and significantly higher than the same period last year. We need to do more to combat the scourge of methamphetamine in this state. Let me talk about the shootings that have occurred in this year alone, the non-fatal shootings. Here in Victoria, we've had 23 incidents that involved a shooting where someone was injured. It's safe to say that the large majority, if not all of those events, were linked to the illicit drug trafficking trade and organised crime generally. Of course, we have this challenge around family violence in this country and in this state. While many family violence perpetrators will have a substance abuse problem, and approximately 1 in 6 family violence incidents, the perpetrator will be drug affected. Drugs, especially methamphetamine, are extremely destructive for families. We know that when a family violence perpetrator is drug affected, the risk of physical harm to family members is exacerbated. Let me now touch upon the number of homicides that we've had in relation to the use of illicit drugs. Some convictions that have occurred in more recent times. In March of this year, a man was sentenced to a total of I'll say that again. In March of this year, a man was sentenced to a total of 27 years imprisonment for a stabbing murder of his wife and daughter while in a drug-induced psychosis. In October last year, a man was sentenced to 23 years imprisonment for the stabbing murder of a man who, until that day, he did not know, whilst he was high on methamphetamine. In August 2020, 4 young men were each charged with 1 count of murder for their roles in the fatal assault of a man, that man, not known to them, and involved, again, the use of methamphetamine. The harm caused by the use of methamphetamine ripples throughout the community and does not just affect those using the drugs. As Hilda indicated, we have a medical practitioner that will talk to you about the individual impacts of illicit drugs momentarily. There have been many lives forever changed and ruined simply by the sheer misfortune of encountering someone who chose to take methamphetamine. As we have said many times before, there is a real concern that the appetite for drugs in Australia is so high that we've become that location of choice, the favourite location for organised crime syndicates. We must challenge attitudes around the use of illicit drugs in our community. There is no safe illicit drug to take. Every single time you engage in illicit drug use, you put yourself at risk of harm as well as every other person around you. To that end, our work doesn't stop with the seizure and these arrests in the last 24 hours. We will pursue every avenue of inquiry possible to complete this investigation going forward. It is just begun in terms of this investigation. There is no doubt that this syndicate will take a massive monetary hit as a result of this outcome, which is crucial as we work together to have these syndicates held to account. Drug offences are a key focus of Victoria Police right across our organisation. We have zero tolerance for the use for those bringing harm to our community, importing and trafficking these drugs. Here in Victoria, we enjoy very, very close working relationships with the AFP in particular and our other law enforcement and intelligence partners. We are, again, combining our efforts and our capability to tackle serious organised crime and the importing of methamphetamine. Our message to those involved in the manufacture and trafficking of illicit drugs is clear. We will continue to work closely with our law enforcement and intelligence partners to target you and crush your organisations. Thank you, Hilda.
Thank you, Bob. I'd like to introduce Royal Canadian Mounted Police Superintendent Eric Gordon.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. My name is Superintendent Eric Gordon. I'm the Regional Director for the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in the Indo-Pacific. The RCMP is proud to have contributed to this landmark operation, and we commend the hard work of the Australian Federal Police, our Five Eyes law enforcement group partners, and the Victoria Police in this momentous effort. The challenges posed by transnational organised crime affect us all, and global collaboration is key in keeping our community safe. Operation Parks is a perfect example of this kind of collaboration. The RCMP worked closely with our domestic and international partners from the outset. Upon receiving information from the Canada Border Services Agency of a possible drug shipment in January 2023, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police alerted the Australian Federal Police that close to 3,000 litres of liquid methamphetamine were bound for these shores. Between December 2022 and June 2023, Canadian authorities seized mass quantities of both liquid and crystal methamphetamine bound for Australia. The total estimated Australian street value of these drugs is assessed at $1.7 billion. All of these shipments were substituted with harmless substances, giving our Australian counterparts time to identify offenders and determine their connection to organised crime syndicates. One of the individuals charged is alleged to have connections to an organised crime network in Canada. Combating organised crime is a major priority for the RCMP, and we're committed to keeping Canadian communities safe from its harmful effects. The sheer distance that these harmful drugs would have traveled shows the extent of the reach of transnational organised crime, a threat that knows no borders. In the end, the successful interception of these shipments demonstrates what can be achieved when the international law enforcement community works together. I should note that this is an active, ongoing investigation in Canada, so we won't be providing further details at this time. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'd like to introduce Canadian Border Services Agency Liaison Officer Ryan Ord.
Excuse me. Good morning, everyone. My name is Ryan Ord, and I'm a Targeting Liaison Officer with the Canada Border Services Agency, or CBSA. It is my honour to be here today with the Australian Federal Police and Victoria Police, and I would like to congratulate them as they announced the arrest of individuals connected to an international drug smuggling ring. Yesterday's arrests are directly linked to a number of significant seizures of methamphetamine in the Vancouver area of British Columbia in Canada. This includes the largest seizure of methamphetamine in CBSA history. In the last 6 months, our officers have seized more than 6,330 kilograms of methamphetamine. Using state-of-the-art technology and a variety of examination techniques, including our detector dog service, we're keeping contraband goods, such as narcotics, from reaching and harming communities. This is a key priority for our agency, and we will continue to work closely with our Canadian and international law enforcement partners to detect and prevent illicit cross-border activity and to help ensure that those who break our laws are held accountable. I would like to acknowledge the great work of my CBSA colleagues back in Canada and our domestic partners, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. I would also like to extend a special thank you to our law enforcement partners in Australia and New Zealand for their role in combating the illegal international drug smuggling between our countries. The CBSA is proud to play a role in this global effort to keep all our communities safe. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. And I'd like to now introduce Dr. Alison Money.
Good morning. As mentioned, I'm Dr. Alison Money and I'm the Chief Medical Officer for the Australian Federal Police. I have 29 years' experience as a medical practitioner, and importantly, like many, if not all of you, I'm a parent, a partner, a child, a sibling. I have conversations with the people I care about about the dangers of illicit drug use. And I'm hoping after today you will start that conversation or continue to have that conversation with the ones that you care about. This is not a conversation about stigmatising users. This is about educating and supporting the people we care about. If I can be frank, Operation Parks and the attempt to traffic an extraordinary amount of methamphetamine into Australia has highlighted the need for a community conversation about illicit drug use. Methamphetamine is highly addictive, has significant physical, mental and social impacts on users, families, communities. Methamphetamine use profoundly impacts every major organ system we have. A single episode of use can be sufficient to result in chronic addiction, and chronic use can have catastrophic consequences for physical and mental health. Every day, on average, 40 people are admitted to Australian hospitals from methamphetamine, heroin or cocaine use. Every week, on average, 40 people are admitted to, every week on average, 16 Australians die from heroin, amphetamine or cocaine use. Every life matters. Every conversation you have to educate the people you care about matters. Every conversation we have on how to support those who are using illicit drugs matters, because tackling this scourge is a whole of community issue. I know Australians are all busy, but taking the time to have these conversations, speaking to medical professionals, support services, could be the conversation that saves a life. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Money. Happy to take your questions.
Is this the biggest seizure in total in Australian history?
We are alleging that this is one of the biggest seizures that we've seen come into Australia, and certainly one of the biggest seizures into Victoria.
Most of the drugs obviously were seized in Canada, but where do we believe the origin of the drugs is? Is it another country?
We're still investigating that. It's not appropriate to say, but we know that we will work with our Canadian counterparts to ensure that we are able to identify where the source of these drugs are coming from. We know that they're coming across all around the world, so we will continue to explore that.
Do we know why Australia, as Bob mentioned, is one of the worst offenders in drug use? Apart from the ready income, why is it, do you think?
So Australia, as Bob said, has a high interest in consuming all illicit drugs. The Australian market is also very lucrative for criminal enterprise. In Australia, we pay for drugs more than any other country in the world, and we know that criminal syndicates are leveraging the Australia's thirst for drugs and taking illicit substances, and also being able to use other services such as logistics companies and the like to facilitate the transport of illicit commodities and drugs.
But why? Why do you think Australians are more susceptible than anywhere else? What is it about our society?
Well, drugs are a problem globally. It's not just Australia. The message is that we know that drugs are being used a lot in Australia, and what we're urging people to do is to take note of the harm that drugs can do to yourself and the addiction and the crimes that get committed as a result of drugs, and seek the help that you need.
Julie, you said before some of these groups are trying to corrupt officials, and in some of the quotes that you've included in that press release, you identified state actors working with organised crime groups as well. Can you talk a little bit more about which state actors or what you mean by that?
Yeah, and I want to be clear, we're not suggesting within Operation Parks that the alleged offenders here are linked to state actors. What we're saying is that transnational serious organised crime, or TSOC, is a global problem. We know that in some regions of the world, state actors are connecting with TSOC groups to send through illegal commodities and funnel funds through their organisations to be able to support the criminal activity. And what we're saying is that TSOC generally is undermining the Australian community, our legitimate economy, our ability to keep services going, and also inflating the services that are legitimate. and it's really undermining Australia's way of life. So that connection between TSOC and state actors is intelligence that we're seeing, and the AFP has called that out in previous conferences.
Can you identify which state actors you're concerned about?
Not here to talk about countries, we talk about criminality, and we will certainly focus on any state criminal enterprise that is trying to undermine Australia's community.
Did any of the drugs mentioned here today, did they make it to Australian shores?
No, as the Canadian authorities have outlined that they were substituted with inert objects, so to make sure that no harmful drugs came into the Australian population. But during the operational activity, we had located another amount of cocaine, between 10 to 15 kilos, that we know that the criminal syndicate operating here in Australia was also, we will allege, possessing.
Hilda, these men who've been charged, are these guys just the bottom of the rung, or where do they sit in terms of the organisation of the syndicate?
We will allege that at least one of the males had direct links to the organised crime syndicate in Canada. So that male had a direct facilitation ability. But whether they sit on the top of the rung or the bottom of the rung, we will be alleging that these men are involved in significant harm to the Australian community, that they will have been charged in various offences related to the possession and import of border-controlled drugs, and any involvement in criminal activity will be investigated by the AFP, Victoria Police and our partners.
You mentioned that you expect more arrests to be made in Australia. Do you know how many more?
We can't say now. The matter's still before the court. As we said earlier, this is the beginning of the investigation. Our intent was to make sure that we were able to highlight to the Australian community the significant seizure as a result of international cooperation, the great work by our investigators and capacity areas within the joint organised crime teams, working with our international partners to prevent a significant amount of drugs coming into the Australian community. And it's really important to highlight that this investigation will keep going. And as Bob has said previously, that we will not stop. We will continue to run down every lead that we can to make sure that criminal enterprise can't exploit the Australian community.
Have any other arrests been made in Canada or New Zealand in relation to this operation?
I'm just going to talk about the Australian connections at the moment. As you can appreciate, there are still some investigations that are going on in Canada and other countries such as New Zealand. So it's not appropriate to say, but we are continuing to investigate here in Australia.
Can you also clarify whereabouts in New Zealand the seizure was? Obviously there was Vancouver was mentioned. What area in New Zealand?
I don't have that information on hand, and I'll let New Zealand Police be able to outline those details coming in the future media.
Superintendent Gordon question, if that's all right. Firstly, how were the drugs found, and do you believe that this mode of transporting the drugs or attempting to transport the drugs into Australia through these canola oil bottles had been successful before the detection in December 2022?
I can't speak to the details of that. I mean, I can say that the transnational organized crime groups are very inventive and will keep changing their methodologies as we detect what they're doing. But I'll refer the initial detection question to the Canada Border Services Agency. They were the agency that did the initial detection.
So in this case, it was marine container shipments of canola oil.
And how were they detected?
We have a number of detection technologies, but I did mention the detector dogs were heavily involved in identifying the methamphetamine within the canola oil.
Do you know if they were on going on to private ships or were they commercial ships?
As commercial container ships.
And sneaker dogs.
Exactly, yeah, like the detector dogs, yes.
So it wasn't a tip-off, you didn't know exactly what you were looking at, it was good detection.
Well, in terms of the investigation that went into identifying them, I can't comment on, but in terms of identifying that narcotics were in the shipment. It was the detector dogs were involved. Yes.
Do you believe more needs to be done to secure the ports? Because this is obviously the main route that drug smugglers are using to transport huge quantities of drugs. What needs to be done to stop them using the ports in this way?
Well, I won't comment on policies that are outside of my remit, but any sort of additional comments can be sought from media at cbsa-afc.gc.ca.
Well, can I ask, when your members attend jobs like you were describing, family violence jobs and a range of others, what's the type of behaviour that they're faced with when they encounter somebody who's high on ice or meth?
Well, as the doctor indicated, methamphetamine is a stimulant, and it exacerbates human behaviour to a point where people are out of control. And that's a challenge for law enforcement generally, but here in Victoria, we're faced time and time again in seeing the drug-fueled violence across our streets, in our homes, and as I said earlier, on our roads.
So they might be violent towards your officers or paramedics, for example?
I think there's a number of incidents that I can recall off the top of my head through my own experience, where our members have been assaulted, ambulance officers have been attacked, other emergency workers are at risk because of the psychotic nature that these types of drug cause to a human brain.
What do you think it is about our society, apart from the relatively high income, that makes us so susceptible to these drugs?
Well, as I indicated, law enforcement in particular, governments, state and federal, we're challenged by the fact that here in Australia we have such a lucrative market for transnational serious and organised crime entities that see Australia as one of the most lucrative environments for them to peddle their misery. We are and do enjoy living in an affluent society, and we have done for many, many years. For one reason or another, our population, our community, see these drugs as an activity that they wish to engage in for whatever reason. As law enforcement agencies, we've continued to advocate public education, raising awareness that this type of illicit drugs more generally cause to society. It erodes society. It harms society. We're all affected by it, all of us. I only touched upon the effects of the criminal behaviour and the behaviour of individuals across the community, but there's the impacts that go further than that, as Hilda said. Our health sector, our economy, our democracy are all impacted by the use of illicit drugs in this country.
Separately to this, media of today, the new crime statistics are out for Victoria. How big of a contributing factor are illicit substances to seeing, I believe it's basically up across the board, sort of percentage rise in crime?
Well, we know illicit drugs is a significant enabler and driver of criminal behaviour in this state, across the nation. The illicit drug market, those that are involved, in the trafficking and in the importing of these drugs, entities that, again, are driven by greed, driven by their own, desires to build wealth, and they'll stop at nothing, and they have no consideration for others in, as I say, peddling their misery and trafficking drugs, importing drugs in this country.
Well, I see that a couple of the offenders are alleged to have imitation firearms. Were these arrests particularly dangerous? Do you think they have further links to weapons, things like that, with SOG use, for example?
Yes, certainly we use specialist resources to effect the arrest of some of these individuals, and some of these individuals, if not all, are known to law enforcement, so they have history. The I suppose, nature of transnational serious organised crime involves, amongst other things, the use of firearms, resorting to violence, using firearms to effect their means. We've seen that play out time and time again with the homicides we've experienced in this state and other states across the country. We've seen it, as I said earlier, in just some of the violence more generally, the kidnappings, the extortions, the aggravated burglaries, the list goes on.
Were you aware of the individuals who have been arrested before you were contacted by the Canadian authorities?
That's one question I'll have to defer to our media unit to answer that, unless Hilda can, but they were certainly known to us in terms of their histories, but again I'll have to defer to Hilda on that one.
Well, this, it was touched on earlier, there are a lot of big drug busts made. Does it just feel like a never-ending battle? Do you feel like the tide is turning at all?
Well, certainly we've seen, and it will be a result of this seizure, an impact. There's no doubt about that. When we look at the Australian Crime Intelligence Commission reports, the wastewater, data tells us that, across the eastern seaboard, I think it was close to 5 tonnes of, or thereabouts, of methamphetamine used over a 12-month period. So if you're talking about this seizure alone, this is going to have a significant dent on the serious organised crime, the transnational serious organised crime entities here, abroad, and it will affect the drug market going forward in a positive way, in terms of it will see, not the prevalence in the in the not too distant future. It will certainly have an impact.